Oh shit. Oh no. What the fuck is this? Another socialist jumping in to criticize Hasan? What is all this leftist on leftist violence? Did we learn nothing when the Social Democrats murdered Rosa Luxemburg? Probably not. But leaving that aside, I want to start this by saying that I don't hate Hasan. And although I think he does deserve a lot of criticism, as this video will hopefully show, I do think there should be a difference between addressing your political opponents compared to someone that you could consider as one of your own. So if you are here for some brutal takedown where I call Hasan a dumb himbo or a political boy or Mr. Baby Potato Head, I'm not going to be doing that. Except from just there as an example. But enough of this polite, bromantic, Mickey Mouse bullshit. I know you people want to be entertained, so let's make some arguments. This whole flim-flam started during the lead-up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On February the 11th, Joe Biden warned that Putin could attack the country as soon as the 16th and urged any Americans in Ukraine to leave as soon as possible. This was interpreted by many people as inconclusive intelligence, and officials in Europe had taken a more skeptical position, with one saying they refused to buy it, and another, when asked if an invasion was imminent, said it was difficult to say. Hasan was similarly skeptical himself.
What's up, folks? I'm live and alive, and we got a lot to talk about. I was right about Ukraine. That's right. War is not imminent. Oh, shocked. Shocked to find out. Anyway, we're going to talk about that and a bunch of other stuff, so get in now.
Now, at this point, I would say he wasn't making any huge mistakes. Invasion technically wasn't imminent at the time. However, when the given date had passed and US intelligence continued to insist that the risk of invasion was very high, Hasan seemed to grow increasingly confident.
I think maybe I'll tell my editors to do this, but I think I'll just change I'll change this every day to Ukraine has still not been invaded by Russia every day to make sure that the wishes of these f***ing weirdo, I'm actually a sock them and you're a f***ing tanky idiots on the internet. Will, yeah, change it to Russia still has yet to invade Ukraine. And it's like day 11 at this point.
Then, on February 21st, Putin officially recognized the independence of two separatist regions in Ukraine and ordered Russian troops to enter the country under the role of peacekeepers. A term that hasn't aged especially well. But why am I starting with this? Hasan already admitted he was wrong here, didn't he? Well, kind of. The next day, he uploaded a video entitled "I Was Wrong About Ukraine," where he does concede that he didn't expect an invasion. However, in the first 60 seconds, he goes on to once again challenge the US State Department, this time on their warnings about Russia moving beyond the separatist regions and attacking Kiev.
Because there's been a lot of information that has been wrong, completely wrong, and there's still a lot of information that the Western State Department is pumping out by way of mainstream media about Russia is going to go and overtake Kiev and they're going to go into Ukraine. Yeah? I would look like Tim Pool after that 49 state landslide L if, there was a active bombing currently happening on Kiev and Ukrainians were being murdered left and right at this moment. I would be that way if America was like, we're going with a full-throated, this is a full-blown invasion, and yet it hasn't happened.
So this isn't a great look, but I don't want this to just be another video gloating over the usual collection of viral Hasan clips. He's already shown a willingness to admit when he's wrong, and I'm sure he would have no problem doing the same when it comes to Kiev, if he hasn't done it already. But for me, being wrong isn't really the problem so much as why you're wrong. If I had to guess, he was probably wrong in this case because he wanted to take a position that contrasted from the US State Department, but I can't prove that. Maybe he just took a skeptical position which was reasonable at the time, but then naively took it to a level of absolute confidence. Either way, the more important thing, at least in my opinion, is the process. It's how you arrive at your conclusions. And in this video, I want to take a look at Hasan's process, how he forms his arguments, and then we'll see if we can find any problems. Part 1. Who do we trust? First off, Hasan is a difficult creator to respond to. mostly because his content consists of live stream uploads, some of which are over 3 hours long. And it is tempting to just make a video using viral clips from those streams, and there will be 1 or 2 of those, but I wanted to go a bit further than that. Last month, Hasan did a reaction stream to a video called How the Gravel Institute Lies to You About Ukraine by a video essayist called Adam Something. Now, don't worry, this video is not going to be my response to Hasan's response to Adam's response to the Gravel Institute. Instead, I chose this video because I think it gives a really interesting look into how Hasan processes information. The video is over 3 hours long, but I will timestamp each segment I use, and I will link the VOD in the description just in case you're worried about context. So, firstly, I want to look at Hasan's approach to the annexation of Crimea. Namely, this fairly well-known take.
You feeling bad about the Crimean annexation does not change the reality of the Crimean annexation being a completely justifiable act by the Russian government, okay? So that's it.
So, there's a lot to unpack here, but before we get into that, here's a summary of Hasan's position. 1. He argues that the referendum was quote-unquote bullshit and the results were rigged, but 2. He also argues that polling data before and after the referendum showed that the annexation was in line with the wishes of the Crimean people, and 3. The history and demographics of Crimea provide a strong case for the peninsula becoming part of Russia. When it comes to that second point, here is Hasan's justification.
We are going back home. Crimea is in Russia.
By the way, this 95.5% result is bullshit. We know this because, as I mentioned in my original Ukraine video, a Russian state agency accidentally...
Yeah, it's bullshit. It's actually 67.5 if you look at the Gallup polls leading up to the annexation of Crimea, and like 80% if you look at Western polling done in the region in the aftermath of the annexation.
So here we have 2 points. A Gallup poll before the annexation showed 67.5% of Crimeans favoring secession, and the numbers after the annexation moved up to over 80%. Let's start with the first one. I couldn't find a poll that gave this exact number he mentions, but I did find one from 2008 showing that 63.8% of Crimeans wanted to secede and join Russia, although this poll was conducted by the Razumkov Center in Ukraine, not by Gallup. Okay, so I know this seems very nitpicky, but I promise I'm doing this for a good reason. If he did just cite the wrong agency, that's not a big deal. But the point is, Hasan has said that he has some degree of trust for polling done by Gallup. Just keep that in mind for now, because a few minutes later in the stream, one of Hasan's chatters linked a poll from 2013 arguing that Crimean support for joining Russia was only 23%.
Wait, what? In 2013, a Gallup poll showed Crimea joining Russia only had 23 support? I'm confused. What are you referring to? I'm referring to the only study that wasn't directly conducted by the CIA when I'm talking about it. Like Gallup, which still has Western biases, but certainly is, I think, a little bit more honest than a public opinion survey from, the International Republican Institute with funding from the United States Agency for International Development. I mean, dude, I agree that Russia Today is like, propaganda, and then you literally pointed to a US aid-backed study.
Right, so I'm just going to put this sentence up on the screen so we're not missing anything. Now, when Hasan expresses a degree of preference for Gallup polls, I wonder how he would feel then if he noticed that the poll he's laughing at was conducted by Gallup. Like, not only is it on the first sentence of the report, which is visible on his screen, it's also on the cover, which he was reading out loud.
Like Gallup, which still has Western biases, but certainly is, I think, a little bit more honest than a public opinion survey from, the International Republican Institute with funding from the United States Agency for International Development.
And in case you didn't notice it, the chatter who sent him the link mentioned it too. Let's just think about what happened to medium rare OG when this happened. My guess is they will have heard Hasan citing a Gallup poll, Googled something like Gallup poll Crimea, clicked on the top result, found that the numbers were very far from what Hasan was saying, asked for clarification, and quite politely, I should say, and then just got blasted for it. Like, Hasan, you were the one who brought up the Gallup poll. All this person did was look up your claim and ask you about it. I mean, which one is it? Is it that we trust the Gallup poll even though it wasn't conducted by Gallup, and we don't trust the poll which was conducted by Gallup because it also involved US aid? Are we operating on the premise now that everything coming out of US intelligence agencies is automatically wrong? Apart from when they successfully predicted the Russian invasion, of course. Now, to be clear, I'm not claiming to know which of these figures is the most accurate. More on that in a minute. But for now, let's look at Hasan's take on polls that were done after the annexation.
If you look at the Wall Street Journal, you see the same exact argument. If you look at the Financial Times, if you look at, quite literally, any news article from the West, okay, not just the East, but from the West, you will recognize that Crimea, straight the up, is in line with the decision made in the annexation, okay, in the fake, bullshit, phony voting that was conducted in the annexation. And for some reason, not a single person ever that wants to talk about Crimea ever brings that up. Ever. I don't know why.
So here he is completely correct that support for the annexation has been consistently high since 2014. One of those polls was even done by Gallup. But if he's wondering why people don't acknowledge that, I'd imagine it's because there are very obvious problems that come up when you're polling people in annexed territory. An article from 538 showed that polling results were incredibly volatile before the annexation and have only recently become more consistent because the Kremlin is now in a position where they can manufacture their own approval. Since 2014, the Crimean people have been subjected to levels of propaganda described as comparable to that of the Soviet Union, and with limited access to alternative sources. Some of Russia's political opponents in Crimea have already been outlawed, and pollsters have acknowledged that a range of intimidation tactics have made face-to-face polling increasingly difficult, especially for people with dissenting opinions. Meanwhile, up to 300,000 Russian citizens have moved to Crimea in the last 8 years, meaning that a poll today could reflect their opinions, but not those of the tens of thousands of Crimeans who fled during the occupation. This is why these results should at least be taken with a pinch of salt, and even if they were true, the idea of highlighting majority approval whilst the minority faces human rights abuses hardly seems like a good ethical stance. If I had to guess why Hasan was so adamant to dismiss the US aid poll, even though it was conducted by Gallup, I'd imagine it's because his entire position here is hinging upon whether or not the annexation had majority support. Now, I've already said that I don't know which of these results is correct, but for me, it doesn't really matter, because my argument would be this. Neither of these results would justify the annexation of Crimea. Part 2. Is Putin literally... So, let's just simplify things. Let's assume that this result is correct. F it, let's say this one's correct. Can we still say that the annexation of Crimea was wrong? Like, very, very wrong. Well, in my opinion, yes, and here's why. First, we have what I'll call the shit-lib argument, which is that the Crimean referendum was insanely illegal. It was illegal under both the Ukrainian and Crimean constitutions and under international law. Whatever the will of the people living there, the idea of rolling tanks in and holding a referendum at gunpoint should probably be off the table. You might run into some logistical problems like a referendum that essentially only offers the same option twice. Your military presence might make it difficult for people to communicate with polling agencies, and much more importantly, you've declared yourself a security threat. If you're willing to violate one international principle, what other boundaries will you cross? In the case of Crimea, the Russians conscripted over 25,000 residents, blocked traffic in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, resulting in disruptions to the Ukrainian economy, and they ultimately ended up using the peninsula as a key area to prepare for the invasion. Secession is never a decision that should be taken lightly. especially when it's being done unilaterally and without international recognition. That's why the same lib-cucks who opposed the annexation of Crimea were also right to oppose Donald Trump when he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Even though someone who was pro-Israel could have just as easily argued that Jerusalem should be the capital on the grounds of its population being majority Jewish. Do you see what I did there? Because America's bad. Just remembering my audience. Now, you could say that many borders around the world are far from perfect. That's definitely true. But compared to most of our history, Europe has been relatively peaceful over the last few decades. And many would argue that a mutual respect for existing borders and sovereignty has played a very important part of that. And I don't know about calling myself a liberal, but I do think that argument sounds quite reasonable. Right?
Throw the question marks all you want. I don't give a about the Ukrainian constitution. I don't give a about the Ukrainian border sovereignty that some of you dumbasses are talking about like you're like a 3%er about for Ukraine. Okay? It's so stupid.
Oh. Well, okay. Maybe I have a better chance of getting through to you if I try a more left-wing humanitarian approach. Namely, the protection of minority rights. Very easy hypothetical. If tomorrow a poll found out that 99% of Americans decided they wanted to bomb Wyoming, should they be allowed to do it? No. So that was easy, and I don't think anyone would say that democracy was meaningfully harmed in that decision. Democratic will isn't everything, especially when human rights are at stake. When it comes to Crimea, even if a majority of them wanted to join Russia, it's probably worth pausing to remember that 12% of the people living there are Muslim Tatars. And I know Hasan has heard about them.
Crimea, first and foremost, belongs to the Crimean Tatars. Okay? Crimea has historically been an autonomous region, a kingdom at a certain point. Okay? In its own right. If there is a long list of groups or nations that Crimea belongs to, number one group of individuals that Crimea belongs to is the Tatars. The number two individuals that Crimea belongs to by way of the Crimean Khanate is the Turks. The number three group of individuals that Crimea belongs to is the Russians, because they purged the Tatars and now more Russians live there. Okay. Maybe number four, Greece. Fuck it. Give it to Greece instead. And then number five on there is Ukraine. Okay? Number five is Ukraine. This idea that you have any sort of sovereignty and any sort of constitutional sovereignty that needs to be held together. Crimea belongs to Mongolia before it belongs to Ukraine. So Ukraine number 6 in that situation. Okay? The idea that it belongs to Ukraine blows my mind. It just blows my mind. You can say bad take all you want, brother. You can say bad take all you want.
Okay, I know I said this would be a good faith criticism, but I really do think I'm being proportionate here when I say this is one of the craziest things I've ever heard someone say on the internet. I'm pretty sure he's just memeing when he says Greece. Okay. But my real question is, why the would purging the Tatars and importing Russians be a good reason for Russia to have a stronger claim over Crimea than Ukraine? Bearing in mind that Crimea only became a Russian majority after the ethnic cleansing policies of Stalin, is that the rule now? We get to do imperialism today based on the fact that it happened in the past? And not to mention, if Hasan really does think that Crimea primarily belongs to the Tatars, maybe he could have checked in to see how they felt about the annexation? And I say that not just because of the ways they were historically treated by Russia, but also because of the way they're currently being treated by Russia. The human rights abuses endured by the Tatars since 2014 have already been fairly well documented. These have included, but are not limited to, physical attacks, enforced disappearances, the banning of Tatar media, the banning of the Tatar executive body, detention and fines for single picket protesters, and baseless terrorism-related prosecutions. If you remember this slide from earlier in the video, the victim of that one extrajudicial execution was a Tatar activist called Reshat Ametov. In March 2014, he was abducted by Russian paramilitaries after holding up a Ukrainian flag in front of the Crimean parliament as a lone protester. 2 weeks later, he was found dead. Forensics reported that he had been tortured and most likely died of brain damage after one of his eyes was gouged out. This is why you can't just look at polling numbers to justify the action. The fact that the Tatars boycotted the referendum should have been an obvious warning sign when the Russians invaded. Much in the same way, a majority of Austrians supporting the Anschluss should have been very easily dismissed on the grounds that over 180,000 Austrians at the time were Jewish. Wait, did I just mention the Anschluss? Oh shit.
And Hitler invaded countries based on Germanic ties at first? Yeah, dude. Talk to me when he's throwing Ukrainians in a what are you talking about? Talk to me when he's throwing Ukrainians in a concentration camp, okay? Hitler wasn't bad because he decided to invade Austria. He was bad because he was killing Jews, okay? That was the problem. He wasn't like, oh yeah, we're gonna annex territory with like Germanic people in it. That wasn't the main problem with Hitler, I think.
So, I don't know who Hasan has been talking to here, but I'd imagine whoever he's arguing with would actually say something like, this one thing is bad and this one thing is worse. Let's just put it this way. If someone asked you to list all the European leaders of the last 100 years who started by annexing territory on the grounds of uniting blood and soil, then followed up by invading a neighboring country, I'm just saying it's a small club. And is it a coincidence that in both cases annexation was followed up by a full-scale invasion? Well, not really. In both cases, annexation served as a way of gauging how much could be gotten away with. It's a kind of testing of the water. That's why the world leaders at the time of the Anschluss were typically accused of underreacting and something appeasement towards Hitler's actions. With the exception of one gigachad Mexican president, of course. But anyway, we're talking about Hasan, so let's move on. Part 3. Ukrainian Language Laws. For this section, I'll be looking directly at one of Hasan's responses to Adam Something when he plays a segment discussing the language laws in Ukraine. And what I think would be useful here would be to watch what Adam says first and then pause to ask ourselves what we've just heard. Once we've done that, we can hear Hasan's response and then see if there are any problems.
Eastern Ukrainians were horrified at what they saw as a far-right seizure of power, with veneration of Bandera and elimination of equal recognition for languages like Russian.
Service industry workers have since January been obliged to talk to customers in Ukrainian unless clients specifically ask to switch.
If I work, pay my employees' salaries and my taxes, it's none of your bloody business which language I do it in.
And here I want to briefly consider manipulation through word choice. The US recognized the interim government was full of far-right people, the Easterners were horrified at what they saw was a far-right seizure of power, the elimination of Russian as an equal language, the use of emotional, loaded language serves to feed into—
Oh, please, dude.
So, what is Adam saying here? It sounds as if he's commenting on Gravel's use of emotionally loaded language when discussing problems with Ukraine. Particularly, the elimination of equal recognition for languages like Russian. Next, we saw a clip of a woman who now had to speak Ukrainian when speaking to her customers, unless they specifically asked for Russian. And then we hear a suggestion that Gravel is exaggerating the severity of Ukraine's language laws, and he argues this by stressing their use of the word elimination. Maybe he thinks they're dancing a little too close to the words of the Kremlin, who have described the laws as an outright ban of the Russian language, but that's just my guess. Now, so far, Adam has not commented on whether he thinks the Ukrainian language laws are good or bad. Don't worry, we'll get to that in a minute, but let's go back to where Hasan paused.
Oh, please, dude, go ahead. Oh, no, he's not going to say, like, the eradication of language and like, actually enforceable language laws are actually really good. Let's hear it. Please, go ahead. Or is he going to say that about the Turkish government doing that to Kurds, too? Yeah, wonderful experience for the Kurdish people, I'm sure, was when the Turkish government decided, language is illegal. If you speak Kurdish, we will fucking, arrest you.
So Adam has just criticized Gravel for using emotionally loaded terms like elimination, and Hasan clearly disagrees. He goes so far as to call it the eradication of language, and then goes on to talk about the banning of Kurdish by the government in Turkey. Maybe we should find out what's going on here. In 2019, the Rada approved a law which granted special status to the Ukrainian language. The law obliged all citizens to know the Ukrainian language, made it mandatory for public sector workers to speak Ukrainian while performing official duties, required that 90% of TV and film content be in Ukrainian, required for at least 50% of books and print media to be in Ukrainian, obliged print media outlets in foreign languages to print Ukrainian equivalents, and required computer software interfaces and scientific publications to be in Ukrainian. Parts of the law did make exceptions for indigenous minority groups like the Tatars, as well as English and EU languages, but not for Russian. So I don't think I need to convince a left-wing audience that this looks pretty bad. And it's easy to see why the law has been criticized by Human Rights Watch, the European Union's Venice Commission, and even the then newly elected president and frequent Russian speaker, Volodymyr Zelensky. However, what the law is absolutely not is a purge or elimination. In fact, even when the Venice Commission did criticize it, they only targeted specific aspects of the law, but ultimately supported its overall principle and had even previously recommended a state language law for Ukraine. So you might wonder, why did Ukraine do this? Was it because their government was full of Russia-hating fascists? No. I know this irritates some people, but I'm gonna say it anyway because it's true. Ukraine is a country with a very rough history. Whether it was Catherine the Great, girl boss smashing the culture of the Ukrainian Cossacks, the EMS Act in 1876, which banned all publishing in the Ukrainian language, Stalin's purge of Ukraine's cultural leaders, the resettlement of Russians and Belarusians into eastern Ukraine after the Holodomor famine, there's a lot going on here. More recently, Ukraine has had the issue of Kremlin-backed outlets broadcasting propaganda on Ukrainian TV and radio stations, particularly in parts of the country with large Russian-speaking populations, like Crimea and the Donbass. Part of their strategy in the current invasion has even involved the capturing of transmission towers and replacing Ukrainian news programs with pro-Russian broadcasts. Naturally, with 8 years of conflict in the east, Ukrainian concerns about Russian propaganda in their country has become a bit more pronounced. Even Zelensky, despite his more liberal stance on the Russian language, banned 3 of these outlets in 2021. So yes, there were legitimate problems with these laws. But if there's any country in Europe that has a good reason to want to promote its national language, it's probably Ukraine. And to even think of comparing it to the very real purge of the Kurdish language in Turkey is frankly insane. Because the last time I checked, Turkey was not living in fear of being invaded by some Kurdish-speaking superpower. The dying empire of Kurdistan was not systematically propagandizing and fomenting unrest within Turkey's borders, and you get the point. Bearing in mind, the clip we watched in the Gravel video was of a woman who was allowed to speak Russian if her customers requested it. But even when a chatter tries to challenge him on this point, Hasan doubles down on the Turkey comparison again.
The law is that you greet in Ukrainian, you can speak Russian, no problem, you got, man. Brother, I come from a country that literally has similar fucking couched language in their legislative agenda. It is so weird, dude. Like, it's so weird when you just completely overlook something. It's like saying, point to where the racism is in the law. I'm sorry, nothing bars black people from voting. It's actually just grandfather laws. It just means if your grandfather was not allowed to vote, you're not allowed to vote. It doesn't say black people can't vote. Why are you doing that? You don't have to do that. And especially if it's not that big of a deal, then there's no reason for that legislation to pass. Okay? I'm not mixing issues, okay?
Well, you are mixing issues, unless you think the Human Rights Commission would support the sentiment behind grandfather clauses or the persecution of the Kurds. Like, how did this happen? I can only assume that Hasan didn't know the specifics of Ukraine's laws, and he definitely hasn't thought about the context behind them. Did he just hear the words language law and then jump to the first country he could think of that also has a language law? Is this the foreign policy equivalent of throwing someone a football and watching them try to smack it with a golf club? Part 4. The Azov Battalion. So, there are a million ways we can address this issue. I do want to focus on something specific, but I know Hasan cares a lot about this one, so I'm going to cover a few bases. The argument here is that the Ukrainian military has incorporated groups like the Azov Battalion into its ranks, and as a consequence, any support we give to them will also strengthen and embolden their far-right presence. And obviously, I could just respond with the usual memes like, the extent to which Ukrainians have neo-Nazi sympathies is extremely overstated. Data from Pew Research found that anti-Semitic attitudes were lower in Ukraine than anywhere else in the region. I could mention that the far-right's electoral presence has all but collapsed since 2014. And of course, we could mention that the Azov Battalion's numbers are currently estimated to be at about 900, suggesting that a good number of them have already died fighting under a Jewish president in some kind of based Operation Nazi Human Shield. Too far? And then we have the right sector, who once claimed to have up to 5,000 fighters, although this number is almost definitely exaggerated because fascists always lie about their numbers. But even if we believe him, I think it's safe to assume that 6,000 fighters out of an army of 200,000 probably won't be enough for a far-right power grab. However,
I agree it's terrible, but there's only 1,000 members, so it seems tiny and not worth getting mad over. It's not just 1,000 members, man. Ukrainian far-right nationalism, ultra-nationalism is incredibly prominent. Shut the up. And also, these 1,000 people, the number keeps getting smaller and smaller, okay? But they're not the only battalion. They're just the one that got the most coverage, okay? And also, it's 1,000 people that we armed. We did the same exact thing with the Mujahideen. We did the same exact thing with the Contras. Oh, it's just a couple thousand people.
Okay. Can I predict 100% that this won't turn out like it did with the Contras or the Mujahideen? No. What I can do is list quite a few important differences. The Contras and the Mujahideen were anti-government rebels who were funded with the explicit purpose of undermining their governments in their own country. Their rise to power was not some unintended backlash. It was the goal. And this distinction kind of matters because if we are supporting the Azov Battalion, they're only empowered because we're also supporting the Ukrainian military who the fascists would have to defeat in order to gain power. If anything, I would say the Contras, being a foreign-backed anti-government rebel group, would have a bit more in common with the Russian-backed separatist groups in the Donbass, but that's just me. And if we want to talk about the Mujahideen, well, first of all, there were just a lot more of them. The problem with the Mujahideen is that we're comparing a modern developed nation like Ukraine to one of the most politically fractured nations in the region. Groups like the Mujahideen and also the Taliban didn't just owe their success to foreign backing. They also owed it to the existence of a power vacuum that has no equivalent in Ukraine. And you kind of need that equivalent for this comparison to work. What I think Hasan is guilty of doing here is, he's taking the phrase, the US is supporting the Ukrainian military, some of whom are fascists, turning it into, the US is arming fascists, and then linking it to all the familiar stories like Pinochet, the Contras, Operation Gladio, and all the other ones. But of course, foreign policy has changed quite a bit since the Cold War, and that old template of America funds fascist rebel groups with the explicit aim of crushing socialist governments doesn't really fit here. And maybe it's worth asking, if the Azov Battalion ever does decide to turn on Zelensky and try to take over, who do you think the United States will back in that situation? And if you know the answer to that question, any attempt to force this situation under the lens of Cold War containment policy kind of falls apart. But in any case, what is the alternative here? Because I know Hasan doesn't believe we should stop helping Ukraine.
Well, it looks like all that aid we're sending to Palestinians is ending up in the hands of extremists. Therefore, we should stop giving money and aid to Palestinians.
Who's saying don't give aid to Ukraine? Like, who the f***'s out here being like, do not help Ukraine at all? Do not help Ukraine at all. Who is giving guns to f***ing Hamas in this comparison in the same way? Is the CIA training Hamas? Is the CIA giving guns to Hamas?
Okay, so my question here would be, how would we stop that aid from reaching the far-right soldiers? Checks and balances? Do we send aid to Ukraine but then also say, don't give this to the Azov Battalion, in which case they ignore us because they're being invaded? Do we hold back on aid on the condition that they purge all the Nazis from their military? In the middle of an invasion? This is why I think people tend to treat the Azov question as a bit of a non sequitur. It's because the only apparent alternative to it would involve drastically weakening Ukraine's defensive capabilities, and I imagine this is probably not the best time for that. Now that said, it is possible that Russia's actions could destabilize the country to a point where the far right does become empowered, but of course, a good way to stop that from happening would be to support the Ukrainian military, some of whom are fascists, and then we're back at square one. But as grim and unsettling as it is to see these people being armed, a few Azov and right sector fighters in the Ukrainian army are hardly the warning signs of a fascist rise to prominence. Unless there's something I'm missing?
They're gonna f***ing rise to prominence after this. It's over. Russia literally invading Ukraine made this into, a much, much larger problem. You guys know this. Even liberals know this. Okay? What is the old saying? If there's two Nazis at a 10-person table, that means there's 10 Nazis. There's not guilt by association, you f***ing idiot. There are certain levels where you are guilty by association.
Well, if that's where the bar is, then I guess every other country in Europe is now a Nazi country. This is ridiculous. Let's move on. Part 5. Conspiracy theory? Question mark? The last thing I want to look at is how Hasan approaches the sniper killings in the Euromaidan protests. It's currently understood that a good number of the deaths in 2014 were by snipers who were stationed in buildings out of the media's sight. The popular belief is that anti-government protesters were shot by riot police snipers under the pro-Russian government of Viktor Yanukovych. However, some people have claimed to have evidence that the attacks were really coordinated by the right sector. This claim is largely based on a leaked phone call between an Estonian diplomat and the EU foreign policy chief, and sure enough, this is the same evidence that Hasan gives us.
There are allegations that the sniper fire might have been done by right sector and its co-conspirators, which, by the way, is not an insane f***ing take at all. You have to be completely out of your f***ing mind to conclusively say, and by the way, this is not from Russia Today. The footage they're saying is from Russia Today, but it doesn't even f***ing matter. Okay? Yeah, here. This is the call from, here. Ukraine crisis. Bugged call reveals conspiracy theory about Kyiv's snipers. The Estonian foreign minister, Urmas Pate, calls EU's Cathy Ashton about the claim that provocateurs were behind the Maidan killers. The 11-minute conversation was posted on YouTube. It is the second time in a month that telephone calls between Western diplomats discussing Ukraine have been bugged. Okay?
So I looked at that article Hasan brought up. In it, the Estonian minister mentions a doctor called Olga who claims to have witnessed snipers shooting at both the police and protesters, to which Ashton replies, "That's interesting. Gosh." In the article, they quote the minister saying that the snipers were from the new coalition, but what I don't see is any mention of the right sector. Now, this entire phone call is available on YouTube. How many times do you think they mention the right sector? I'm giving it away. The answer is none. They don't mention them, nor do they make any mention of the far right. The claim that the snipers were from the right sector did not come from an Estonian minister or from Olga. It came from the Russian foreign minister, who says he has huge amounts of evidence, but can't seem to point to anything other than that phone call, which was released 3 days prior. This is Hasan, however accidentally, pushing a Kremlin conspiracy theory. And I know he does say it's just an allegation, but he doesn't really hide the fact that it's an allegation he wants to believe.
So even when there is at least like intercepted phone calls that show, okay, intercepted phone calls that literally show that the right sector, which, you know, and the CIA involved, CIA trained right-wing operatives in Ukraine could have perhaps engaged in such a violent action. Okay. When there's a likelihood that is definitely a theory, okay, a very realistic theory, considering they had a lot to gain from this, considering the historical precedent of such actions.
Like, no. With the evidence we currently have, it's not a very realistic theory. It's a Russian minister adding his own spice to a statement that was made to an Estonian politician, allegedly, by someone called Olga. The only way this seems credible is because it fits that old story of CIA-backed fascists destabilizing the government. But once again, this is not the Cold War, and even if it were, you still couldn't just apply this blanket rule to each situation without looking at the details. For example, even if I go to this Jacobin article, the CIA training program Hasan is talking about didn't start until 2015. 1 year after the sniper attacks. Like, none of this fits. However many examples you have of coups that were done by CIA-backed fascists, you can't apply this to Ukraine. And I don't think Hasan believes the Maidan Revolution was a United States coup, but when we have sentences like this talking about CIA-trained right-wing operatives and considering the historical precedent, it's all a bit... I mean, how many mistakes can you make in one sentence? The phone call didn't show right sector involvement. The right-wing operatives were not CIA-trained. I don't know exactly how much they had to gain from it, given that their leader stepped down in 2015, declaring that the right sector was no longer needed, and their electoral performance has been pretty miserable ever since. But this is the amount of twisting you need to do if you want that historical precedent to fit. Like, if you remove the word Ukraine from this statement and ask someone to guess what country Hasan is talking about, they'd be more accurate if they said something like Chile, Nicaragua, or El Salvador. We're so far removed now that we're grabbing narratives from a different continent and in a different century. It's like the world has thrown Hasan a football and he's trying to eat it. I'm sorry. Conclusion. I guess this is usually the part where I play Eric Satie in the background and say some condescending bullshit about how we all get it wrong sometimes, but I won't do that. As I was writing this, I noticed that Hasan had just posted this on Twitter, and I thought it was quite apt. It's true, we probably do agree on most things, and I hope you don't think I'm only doing this for the engagement. Although I do like the engagement, like and subscribe and Patreon, I did consider going for this very ultra-polite approach, but I did feel a bit infantilizing. In any case, I've heard you've become numb to the criticism.
I've gotten numb to the criticism. Like, it's not. As a matter of fact, I seek it out now.
But I'd like to believe that you're not numb to the point where you can't see where you've gone wrong. So I really hope you have gained something from that, and if you haven't, that's fine. I was going to say something mean at the end, but I decided not to, so take care.